Hi, I'm Greg Smith, aka the laziest programmer in the world, and today we're going to look at AWS Cognito. For the longest time, I've been wanting to build a project for writers and critique groups. I spent about 8 years being the agile writer, helping people write their first draft novels in 6 months. And during that time, we had meetings, and every meeting people would bring their papers to be critiqued. And there's a lot of confusion over who submitted what and what happens to the marked up pages and so on. So what I thought I'd do is create a website where people could submit their writings, actually create entire critique groups, and then keep track of all of the critiques that were done. And so the first step, this is sort of a membership site, is to create a login. And AWS Cognito does this really well. So we'll be using AWS Cognito to do authentication. Now remember that authentication is making sure that you are who you say you are and allowing you into your system. Whereas authorization is role-based. What resources do you have access to and what role do you play? For example, are you a member or an editor or an administrator? Each one having different roles and responsibilities and hence access to information. So let's get started. Let's take a look at AWS. So let's get started with AWS Cognito. First step, of course, is to log into our console on AWS. You should already, and once you're in, you'll want to go to AWS Cognito, which is under the Security, Identity, and Compliance section, and you'll want to manage user pools. Once in this area, you'll want to create a user pool, and you'll want to give the pool a name. So remember, what we're doing here is that we're creating a login capability, and AWS acts as both the database and also the login badge. So we'll start off by giving the pool a name, Agile Writer Workshop, and then AWS Cognito allows you to create a variety of different ways of logging in. The typical way people log into a membership website is by way of their email address. And so we'll start off with that. And mind you, the settings that we choose here for this user pool or this login authentication system can't be changed once we set them. So we're just going to allow only the email address. That's kind of typical. We're also going to enable case insensitivity for the username input. And that's important because sometimes people use upper and lower case in their email addresses. And so we don't want to be confused between two different email addresses. And it can be confusing for the user when they do log in if they happen to change case between times of logging in. Also, I want to collect some standard information, including their email address, their family name, and their given name. And mind you, this is the information that's going to be stored in the login database. There are a ton of other things that you can select here. I'm not going to put a lot of things here because all of these things that we check must be entered when you create your account and will be stored as part of your identity. And what I want to do is separate out the things that are part of my authentication from my my profile, for example. And so things like a nickname or phone number or a picture, I consider those things part of a profile, and I don't really want to put that into the authentication. Okay, so once we've selected these items, you cannot change these. Almost everything else about your attributes can be changed once you've created them. So let's go to the next step. The minimum length of the password, I'm going to take the defaults here that we must have 8 characters minimum, that we require a number, a special character, an uppercase letter, and lowercase letters. I'm also going to allow users to sign themselves up because I want people to add themselves rather than have administrators create users. When the user first logs in, they'll be given a temporary password and an email will be sent to them again to identify themselves as having the account that they put the email in for. And they'll have 7 days to do that. I'm going to take that default. I don't care for multi-factor authentication for this project. If somebody forgets their email forgets their password, they want to be able to recover their account, I'm going to allow them to use only email to get that. There are other ways. You can use phone numbers, or you can have them call the administrator somehow by way of email or other method, and then have the administrator, which would be me, recover their account. But I'm going to go ahead and create by email only, which is pretty typical. And we're only going to select the email. We're going to require the email. And you can use phone numbers. And when you use phone numbers, in that case, you get an SMS message or a text message on your phone. I'm not going to do that today. I want to keep things simple. And if you did, you would have to create an SMS role, which is what this is offering here. I'm not going to create this role, so we're going to go on to the next step. And in this case, we're not going to be setting up SES, but we do want to set up the from email address for who this comes from, and I'm going to use my Agile Frontiers email address. Now, do you want to go through your SES configuration? If you don't have a simple email system set up with Amazon, then I would suggest that you not use SES. But in my case, I actually do have SES set up, and so I'm going to select that. Now, down below, you can customize your email messages. I'm going to leave the default for now, and the verification type is going to be of type code rather than link. You'll be sent a code that will identify you as being the person that you say you are. And we're going to use the default messages. So there we go. And I'm not going to add any tags. I do not want to remember my user's devices. And then we do want to create a user app or an app client. And we're just going to call this Agile Writer Workshop. We'll take the defaults, which is the tokens expire after 30 days, or 60 minutes for the access token and the ID token in 60 minutes. We'll generate a client secret. We're going to leave the flow configuration alone. So let's create our app client. So now we have an app client that's created. So the next step is, do we want to customize our workflows? And you can do things like require some setup that happens before you sign in and before authentication. All of these things can trigger Lambda events. We're not going to do any of those today. Okay, so we're just about through. We've got all of our values set, and we can now create our pool. So now that we've created our app, let's take a look at our client settings, because these are the things that we're going to want to use to get at our login. And so the first thing we want to do is make sure that we set the Cognito user pool. We're going to be using Cognito to manage our users. We need to create a callback URL. And for our purposes, I'm going to use localhost today, localhost 8081 that we return back. We also want to make sure that we set up our scope, which is we must set the authorization code grant and the implicit grant. And then we want to use email and OpenID as our OAuth 2 scopes. So now that we've created our OAuth 2 settings, we also need to choose a domain name. And this can be any name you want. It's not actually your domain of the app that you're creating, but it's a domain that you can use to access Cognito from your website. So we'll check the availability. That's available. That's fantastic. We could use our own domain, but for today we're not going to. Great. So now this is set up. We can customize the UI. I'm not going to change anything or anything much. I am going to choose a graphic. There we go. So I'm going to choose my Agile Writer book, and the logo must be relatively small. I think something like, and go back to the summary. And at this point, we're all done with the setup. We've got our domain set up. We've got our UI customized, and we don't have any resources at this point. Or we could actually set up some identity providers like Facebook or Google or Apple. But for today, we're going to use our own setup. And now that we've got this set up, we can actually go to a URL that is our hosted URL. And this is now what our login looks like. And I'll go ahead and log in as the first time. And if I try to log in with Agile Frontiers, it will show that Agile Frontiers is not a login that it knows. So I'm going to sign up and put in my given name. and my family name. So this is now the login that people will see when we go to our website and we click the login link. This URL at the top here is, you may notice, has Agile Writer Workshop, which is the domain name we put in, plus the region, Amazon, Cognito.com, and then the sign up URL, followed by a client ID. This is the unique ID to us, our website, and then the response type being that we're going to get a code back, the scope being email, which means that we expect and that we must log in with an email, and then the redirection URL, which is localhost:8081 index.html. So once this is all in, we're going to sign up, and now we're going to get an email with our verification code. And there's our verification code. We're going to copy that. That's better. Confirm the account. And when we do, so I did make one minor mistake. I forgot to put in the HTTP protocol for my URLs. And so when I log in is Azure Frontiers, and it takes us back to our site, and we're logged in. Now, before I get too carried away, the other thing I wanted to show you was that in your user pool, if you go back to users and groups, you'll now see that we have a new user, and the username has a cryptic hash code as a name, but it's captured that it's enabled, that the user is confirmed, and has an email. That email has been verified and was updated and created on March 6th. And if we click on that person, we can go in here and see that given name and family name have been stored. And this is something that we can then query from our website and our back-end server at a later date. So that's a huge feature for us. It's a lot of work that we don't have to do. And adding users and keeping track of them is half the battle of doing authentication. So we've successfully created a login backend using AWS Cognito. It gave us a hosted badge for logging in. It collected the user's information, verified their email address, and then sent us back to our website. Now, that's only the first half of the game. The second half is what happens on the back end. You still have to capture that code that it sends back to you and then log that somehow in your session or in your own database so that you know that the session that you're in is authenticated. And we'll do that in part 2. So stick with me and come back for part 2 of AWS Cognito, the back end.